Speak very loudly. But I want to also start by thanking both Pilar and Cinta for giving me the opportunity to participate in this seminar. It's particularly nice for me to meet students of art history in other universities as well. So as Cinta mentioned, the time period that I specialize in is the Ming Dynasty. So what I wanted to do today was sort of paint a picture of the global circulation of goods and during the Ming Dynasty, particularly with reference to ceramics. So I want to start by setting the scene and providing a bit of background and just summarizing the character of trade in the Ming period. Trade was an important source of revenue and goods for China, but it was also a significant source of anxiety, mainly for security reasons, because the Ming had recently conquered the foreign rulers who called themselves the Yuan dynasty, and trade was something they felt that they needed to control. So they established a government monopoly on trade and a ban on private trade. Now that not to say that this didn't lead to things like smuggling, it did, but at least there was a veneer of official control. The kind of goods that were being traded in these ways were staple goods, commodities, but also luxury objects. So things like tea, silk, ironware was a very important commodity for China, currency, evidence that survives of trade during the Ming Dynasty. I would say that there is some evidence that you might not think of that is worth looking at if you're interested in studying trade and trade goods in the Ming. The responses to encounters with trade goods like ceramics can be evidence of the trade itself. So it's worth thinking about that, and I will show you some examples of it. So briefly, just a word about the economics of trade. Ceramics are not inherently in themselves valuable. So what would be the point of trading things like ceramics? Well, you can use them to exchange for other goods, and you can use them instead of hard currency like gold or silver. You can also use them as ballast in ships or liners for the hold. And bear in mind that there were many Chinese people living overseas during the Ming, so you can use them initially as ballast in a shipment, and then in one of the places where the ship arrives and docks, those ceramics can then be sold to local Chinese in that area. So ceramics, bear in mind, are a product. They're a mass-produced good. They're not a luxury item, but that makes them very saleable, and it means they have great utility or usefulness. So what was China looking for in return? Ming in particular, horses, incense, aromatic plants, minerals, gemstones, feathers were quite an important goods for exchange, and raw materials like copper and tin and silver.
Sorry again, Stacey.
That's okay. Should I leave it?
Just a second, they are trying to work it out. Just a second. Okay. Okay.
Carry on?
Yeah, carry on. Yeah, that's it. A little bit still. Okay. Okay, carry on.
Is it safe? Or is that going to hurt everybody's ears? It's quite bad, isn't it? Yeah.
In defense of the university work perfectly yesterday.
Sure.
La verdad es que va fatal.
Hay problemas del amplificador. Debe ser algo que se acople, que sea.
Es que están todos apagados.
Sí, pero debe ser de algún cableado. Claro, no vamos a estar interrumpiendo.
No, bueno, pues déjelo entonces, déjelo. Never mind. We
Okay.
can't do anything about it.
Okay,
Sorry,
as long as you
sorry.
can hear me, we'll keep going. If I'm not speaking loud enough, just raise your hand all the way at the back, okay? So, one thing to bear in mind is that even though in the Ming period trade was officially restricted and controlled, it also was not the main source of revenue for the court. That was agriculture, in fact. So officially sanctioned trade under the government monopoly did develop, but it also importantly included new destinations like Okinawa, for example. They developed a tributary relationship with the Ryukyu Kingdom, for example, in 1372. And so this becomes an important source of trade and exchange of goods in the early Ming period. And when we're talking about cities, as you did yesterday, another important development related to trade in the Ming is the establishment of major port cities as important trade hubs throughout the east coast of China. And this is where the trade offices, shipo, were set up at Ningbo, Quanzhou, and Guangzhou, for example. And these were really important because they regulated overseas commerce. They collected customs duties, which were a good source of revenue. And in theory, they prevented the smuggling of contraband goods. And there's actually archaeological evidence of this. So a Ming warehouse at Yangzhou, at the docks, has been excavated, and they found 30,000 pieces of early Ming to middle Ming porcelain in the remains of those docks. So there is some evidence, but not as much as we would like. Most of what we know about this is based on official government records, textual records from the time. So who controlled the trade itself? Well, from an early period, from the Tang Dynasty, shipping was carried out over short distances, and then goods were transshipped. So they've been moved from one port to another, offloaded, other goods would be loaded, and then the journey would carry on. So you would see things originating in China that would go to Southeast Asia, India, all over the Middle East, with merchants from those areas participating in the trade. So it wasn't controlled by one nation. So you had Indian, Persian, Arab, and Jewish merchants participating in the trade in Chinese goods. You also had Chinese merchant groups who were quite powerful during the Ming, organizing all of this throughout in these various locations. And then, of course, you have the Europeans entering into the trade in the Ming period, the Spanish and Portuguese, and then the East India companies as well. So a lot of non-Chinese were participating in this global trade in Chinese goods. And what were the mechanisms of trade and, of course, the acquisition of Chinese trade goods? Well, obviously, trade and resale. Diplomacy was an important mechanism. Religion. A lot of religious institutions and individuals participated actively in trade and commerce. Intercultural exchange, too, and exchange is quite a neutral term, but this would include plunder, for example, as well as gifts between different cultures. Diplomatic gifts were quite useful because they are outside the normal economic mechanisms, but it was a way of smuggling in luxury goods. Plus, there are maritime routes as well as overland routes. And within colonies around the world, say South America, you see intercolonial trade in Chinese goods during the Ming period. And again, religious establishments often were quite an important part of that. So what is the evidence that we have for all of this? A lot of it's archaeological, both maritime and terrestrial. Shipwrecks, which are useful but also problematic, as I will point out. Habitation sites, both ordinary, domestic, and royal. You have tombs, and that's outside of China. You find Chinese goods buried in tombs, for example. Religious sites, rubbish dumps, warehouses. In England, for example, they've excavated the remains of pubs that were established in, say, the 17th and 18th century, and there's tons of Chinese porcelain found in those remains. Plenty of documents survive, customs records, stories, inventories. Chinta in her book mentions a lot of inventories. Travelers' accounts, inscriptions, and if you're really lucky, ships manifest, but those are quite rare. We also have visual records and objects as evidence, such as paintings, illustrated books, textiles, and designs. So if this is something you want to study, you need to think very broadly about what constitutes the evidence. Okay, that's the background. Now I want to look at just some specific case studies of Chinese goods that went to various regions around the world. And this is just an introductory survey, but I hope it helps to paint the picture of the global circulation of Chinese goods during the Ming. So starting with Japan and Korea, there's a very long history of the consumption and trade in Chinese goods. But if we focus just on the Ming period, which roughly coincides with the Muromachi to the Momoyama periods in Japan, there are sites like this particular castle site, forgive my pronunciation, but Ichijodani in Fukui Prefecture, where this was the residence and the seat of rulership of very powerful clans, such as the Asakura Yoshikiga, who's lived in this castle and consumed and used a lot of Chinese ceramics, not just porcelain. And we know that this site has a terminal date because it was destroyed by Nobunaga in 1573. So some of these sites can help us date the trade as well, even if the archaeological site is not well stratified, for example. You also find slightly later, moving into what's the late Ming in China and early Edo period in Japan, you find a lot of blue and white actual objects, but textual records referring to blue and white in the household inventories and the death inventories of the shoguns, like Ieyasu, for example. In the death inventory, I think it's 1616, there are records that say utensils for entertaining, blue and white tea-bowl, 1,000 in 10 boxes. They were consuming tens of thousands of Chinese ceramics in these places, but we know that they were consumed as banquet goods. So Chinese objects were seen as something essential to a very lavish banquet in Japan at this time. Also, they mention this ware. And the Japanese name for it is quite different, but there are references to a lot of examples of this ware. So we tend to think of this as being very popular in Europe. You may have seen it in some of your lectures already, but in fact, it was extremely popular in Japan as well. And I mentioned that you can look at the impact of encounters on foreign communities as evidence for trade. Well, a good example of that is, of course, the development of porcelain in Japan, which starts after about 1610. So they were making ceramics, obviously, much before this date, but porcelain, and that is sort of Chinese-style porcelain, did not start until 1610 in Japan, and most of the earliest examples are copying very closely Chinese ceramics, but Chinese ceramics made in Japanese taste. So this is a reminder that this is a very commercial product, because the Chinese ceramics were designed to appeal to a very particular market, and then Japan is trying to edge China out of that market by copying those goods and producing them themselves. And a similar process was taken over by the Dutch East India Company, who, when they were active in Japan, it was a time when the Ming was coming to an end in China, so ceramic production and trade was disrupted. So the Dutch stepped in and had Japanese producers making copies of Chinese ceramics. Like this one, this is the Japanese version of a crock dish. And these are being traded to all the markets that the Chinese were trading to originally. So you could call this industrial espionage, because it basically was. But this built on the very successful trade established by China in the Ming. Now, there were other goods going to Japan, of course, luxury goods in particular, such as lacquer. Now, lacquer, being quite fragile and organic, is not as sturdy, so you can't ship it in bulk. you also can't make it in bulk. But it was quite an important product in Japan, particularly in the early Ming, in royal circles and elite circles. So you have dishes like, boxes like this one, which has, similar ones have been found in Japan that have the imperial grain mark written on it, just like this one does. Now this one is in the British Museum, but it was acquired in Japan. Now there's a different story really with Korea and its interactions with China. Korea was very much considered a vassal state of Ming China, and therefore gifts were being exchanged, but there was no extensive trade system between China and Korea during the Ming. But there was a lot of unofficial circulation of Chinese goods, and unfortunately also Korean goods, which included people, were being sent to China in exchange for Chinese goods. So it's typically not a very flattering picture of China's dealings with Korea at this time. However, there are textual references to the diplomatic relations that do mention porcelain. Most of those textual references are in Korean court documents, however. But we can see some impact of Ming Chinese porcelains that were brought into Korea. So this piece was made in later period in Korea, so Chosun Dynasty. But you can see it's imitating very closely early Ming porcelain from China, which was probably of the type being gifted to the court in Korea. Now Korea was also an important stop in the Asian trade route, and they've recently discovered certain locations where it was clear that lots of goods were coming in and out of, including a group of islands, one of which, the main island, is called Ma Island, and they found Korean ceramics, but a wide range of Chinese ceramics that appear to come from the wrecks of 2 ships. So there is a lot more research and archaeological activity focusing on the trade through and around Korea during the Ming. Now if we move to the Near and Middle East, there are so many different areas that I could cover. I'm just going to focus on a few. So I'd like to look closely at the Ottomans. So we're primarily looking at Turkey in this case, and then I'm not going to cover the Ottomans in Europe. Now the Ottomans were great consumers of foreign goods, in particular of Chinese ceramics. They also were very good at keeping records, and Chinese ceramics first appear in the Ottoman court records of 1495. And we think of this today and we call it a collection, an art collection, and it's very much presented as an art collection, but that's not how it was considered to be in the Ottoman palace. These were just goods that they used. Foreign, exotic, and useful and valuable, as we will see. But much of this was tableware that they were using in the kitchens, for example. But the way they acquired it wasn't always through simple mechanisms like trade. The Ottomans were very good at stealing goods from other Middle Eastern rulers. For example, there is a document from 1514 which gives an inventory of the booty taken by Selim I in his campaign against the Persians, the Safavid Shah Ismail, and Chinese porcelains were part of this. So they're actively stealing Chinese porcelains from other rulers. They also required that their local government officials and members of the aristocracy had to hand over their property, including Chinese ceramics, under rules that were defined as sequestering rules, sequestration. In one report, it appears that 395 Chinese ceramics came into the palace in that way. So basically, if you were not immediately related to the royal family, you didn't own your luxury goods. They owned everything, and so when you died, it went back into their possession. They were also used as wedding gifts. So these were exchanged within the Ottoman world as luxury goods for wedding, but they still retain their status as useful things. So this dish, actually on the back of it, says oranges on it. And so we know that this was used as, you know, a serving dish for oranges. Another one says chicken kebab, I think. So they're pretty clear about what these are being used for. Sometimes I think the inscriptions are more interesting than the porcelains themselves. And then one final mechanism was special commissions or gifts. It's possible, this is today in the Topkapi Palace collection, and you can see that it has, I think it's a it's an Arabic inscription on it. And it also has the Chinese rain mark. So this was made in the imperial factory as a diplomatic gift for the Ottomans. And there are Chinese records that appear to confirm this. So that was another way of acquiring Chinese goods. And it was a form of diplomacy. And so you can look at that also as a form of trade, I would say. Now, like Japan, there were other goods being traded from China to the Middle East. Decorated paper was quite popular. Again, it's a luxury good, but on this one you can see it was decorated paper that's painted with a gold, sort of quite typical landscape scene in China, and then it was used as the paper for a book, an anthology of poetry. This is today in the British Museum collection. And silk. It often appears that ceramics were the primary trade good involved in the global circulation of goods in the Ming period, but in fact, it's only because they survived. So the most important one, if one is looking at commodities, were textiles. And obviously textiles don't survive, but there are fragments that appear, often if they're reused in local costume, for example. So you find them in religious garments outside of the Middle East and China. This fragment was found in Egypt, but it's interesting because it's gold or yellow silk. And yellow silk, of course, was exclusively used for the royal court in Ming China, but clearly they were also trading it. So a lot of the restrictions on colors that we read about weren't necessarily exclusive. And paintings were also circulating. These are Chinese paintings that appear in, for those of you who do Islamic art, quite a famous album of works of art and painting that was created for one of the Persian Shahs. It was made in Herat in 1417. So I guess that would be the Timurids. Yeah. So paintings were something that were seen as very exotic and very Chinese in a lot of locations around the world during the Ming. But again, a lot of them don't survive because they were so fragile. So if we look now at India, India is a really important kind of entrepot in the Asian trade in general, not just for Chinese goods, but for all goods that are circulating around Asia. It's also a particular site for consumption of Chinese goods, including ceramics. But you tend not to see finds of Chinese ceramics in South Asia, India, until after what certain parts of the world would call the Muslim conquest. And this is around the 13th and 14th century. So really what you're seeing is Persian consumption habits moving towards India. And that's true with paintings, etc. So once you have that established, you begin to see Chinese ceramics being used in great quantities and specifically purchased in the market for use in India by the Mughals or the Mughals. There are some sites that have been extensively excavated where they have found Chinese Ming porcelains, such as Purana Kila, which was built by one of the Afghan kings. And it's one of the most dominant buildings in Delhi today. And they found porcelains like this. There are very few publications of these, however. I found one which for those of you who know the Chinese side will find it quite amusing because the archaeologists didn't know that much about Chinese imagery, and they said a lot of funny things about what these animals might be and what they might symbolize in China. So you do have to bear that in mind if you're looking at archaeological reports of Chinese material found in locations outside China. But there are some really interesting pieces of evidence for the trade in Chinese porcelain in the Mughal period in India, some that you wouldn't expect. I mentioned at the beginning that tombs are quite important in the cultural history world, but what got me interested is this was commissioned as a mausoleum for the wife of Jahangir, so it's for Nur Jahan, and it's seen as a kind of mini Taj Mahal. But once you go in it, this is going into the doorway, you find all over it has niches in the walls that are painted with what could only have been Chinese blue and white porcelain. And there's also evidence of Chinese porcelain in the Persian royal collections in India at the same time. So Shah Jahan was a great consumer of Chinese porcelain, but in a very Persianate style. Some pieces are circulating in the art market today that have inscription which either mention the name Shah Jahan or show that they were in Shah Jahan's collection. This came up at Sotheby's, I think, fairly recently. And of course, India also included the British, and particularly the British, as traders in goods worldwide, and of course that included Chinese goods. So they are another kind of foreign ruler in India that consumed and traded Chinese goods in India itself, but also through India. And so they shipped, as you probably know, huge quantities of tea and porcelain in relation to the tea all over the world. Plus, members of the East India Company were living in India, so they were consumers themselves in India of Chinese goods. Now, of course, the East India companies were quite important in trade and politics and economics of parts of Southeast Asia. So that's the next region that I want to look at. Again, there's like Japan, there's a very long history of engaging with China. But if you look specifically at the Ming period, there's quite a lot of interesting textual evidence about China's official relationship with various countries in Southeast Asia. And my understanding is that these Chinese texts have been used by specialists in Southeast Asia to learn more about the history there, because a lot of the textual material isn't available. So, for example, we know from Chinese official texts that China sent and received embassies to and from various nations in Southeast Asia. And the trade was in a very particular form, because remember, there's a government monopoly on trade, so this isn't private trade, commercial trade. They called it Chaogong Tishi, which is a form of, it literally was exchange, seemed to be somewhat equal. So the exotic goods that China wanted from Southeast Asia, they would exchange through what appeared to be diplomatic channels for goods from China. But that's not to say that bulk goods are not also being traded. So what China's exporting is silk, cotton, tea, copper coins, iron, and of course a lot of ceramics. And we do have evidence from a lot of shipwrecks from this period. Just a few would be the Brunei junk, the Bin Tuan, the Wan Wreck, the Vung Tau, etc. And of course, we know that China also annexed northern Vietnam in the early Ming period. So, this is quite a complicated time period politically, but also economically. However, because of its location, we seem to have a lot of evidence of trade because of the shipwreck. Shipwrecks have been found all over this area. So all of these red areas, these red dots and triangles, are find sites. More than half of these are shipwrecks. Some of them are in the interior. But there is a lot of information to be sourced here, but you have to use it with caution because that shipwreck only tells you about one moment in time on the journey of that ship. Also, shipwrecks are always disturbed. It is impossible to find a shipwreck that has not been disturbed unless it wrecked yesterday because they are being constantly buffeted by waves, water, other vessels, animals, etc. So things are never where they land initially. They get moved, so it's really sometimes hard to attribute a certain find to a certain wreck. Often the ship itself is totally destroyed, so it's almost impossible to recreate or reconstruct the style of ship and perhaps attribute it to a particular nation or location. Plus, transshipping is still happening because economically it wouldn't make any sense to have a single trade route, like a starting point in China, an end point, say, in the Gulf. You need to be constantly picking up new goods and selling them along the way just to make it financially viable. So it's almost impossible to make any assumptions about trade routes based on shipwreck. And as I said earlier, ships manifest rarely survive. I mean, there are a few, and they can tell you something, but I think as far as I know, the Manila galleon trade, that's a big problem as well there because you just do not have that information. But saying that, you can determine a lot from shipwreck, particularly the kind of things that you find. Now, ceramics are going to survive in greater quantities than the commodities that would have been the primary cargo. But for example, in this particular wreck, we can see that the ceramics are all from one place in China. In Fujian, and in the Western world, these are called SOAS ware or Zhangzhou ware. And so it's not from the place that we're familiar with as the home of porcelain, but in fact, it reminds us that this other production site was extremely successful commercially. And you find examples like this. Now, this was from a wreck of a ship that was, it wrecked in the Philippines, but we don't actually, in spite of what the archaeologists say, we don't actually know where it was going. However, if you look at pieces like this, they're not Chinese shapes, so it's entirely possible that they were making goods for a particular market, so it's been suggested that these were destined for a sultanate in Southeast Asia. And this wreck also reminds us that there's never one cargo. This one also had a lot of Thai goods in it as well. And then finally, something like what's known as the Hatcher wreck, which is named after the person who allegedly discovered it, which can be dated to about 1643. But this reminds us that it's often the ceramics that date the wreck. It's one of the few ways in which you can fairly securely date a wreck, and you can do that because Chinese ceramics are relatively easy to date. It's difficult to do with ceramics from other producers. So just to sum up Southeast Asia, the historical context is that the Ming were major political players in the maritime Southeast Asian world, particularly in the 15th century. They acquired huge quantities of trade goods from Southeast Asia in exchange for porcelain, silk, and coinage. Now, coins are also quite useful evidence. They give you a terminal point, but they tend to, they're small, they're light, they tend to get spread out quite a lot. Chinese coins were in fact quite important in the local economy in various parts of Southeast Asia, and there was quite a lot of, because of the adoption, voluntary or otherwise, of a Confucian style of government, you see Chinese language and literature being used quite extensively in places like, say, Vietnam. Another really important export is weapons technology. It's been argued that the reason Vietnam was able to conquer, China itself, in fact, was because of the trade and exchange of weapons, and then the development of local technology as a result of that encounter. And so what you can kind of say about this is that it's a period of Sinicization of Southeast Asia. And the ceramics are, pretty good evidence of that. Now, the next area I want to look at is Europe and Britain. And I'm only going to kind of run through this because, of course, Cinta has done the most work on this. And most of what I'm going to say is just a reminder of what she says in her book and her publication. But it's worth remembering that this is part of the global picture of the trade in Chinese goods. So if one's going to summarize the situation in Europe and Britain, there are certain specific modes of acquisition and trade that are characteristic, including encounters, but also secondary trade through the Middle East and India, diplomatic gifts and exchange, often between European courts, special commissions from a certain date, plus bulk transport of export goods once there's direct trade with China. And then you have exchange in local markets, auction, inheritance, etc. So lots of different mechanisms of acquisition and trade. So in terms of diplomacy, you see from a relatively early date, Middle Eastern nations exchanging what they considered luxury goods with rulers in parts of Europe. Famous example is the gift from the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1487, which included a giraffe. This appears in a lot of pictorial evidence, but also a lot of ceramics, and these appear in the inventory of his goods in 1492. And then you see pictorial evidence of it too, such as this very famous painting, which I think is in your book, isn't it? Yeah. So there's a small blue and white porcelain cup there. Then, of course, when the Portuguese start establishing trading posts in Asia, in Hormuz and Goa and Malacca, and of course, eventually China, they have their trading base in Macau from 1557. So that becomes an important site for exchange and trade. But even at an early date, there were special commissions from Portuguese consumers, like this one, which has a Portuguese sort of coat of arms, but also a Chinese grain mark. And then, as Cinta has pointed out, there were large quantities, in fact, of porcelains coming into Portugal during the first decades of this direct trade with China, but it was mainly for personal use in the royal court. But they were also being sent as gifts to their relatives at European court. And this is all starting because of Manuel I, whose wife was, of course, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, but you guys know all this history. So, from 1513, direct trade with China starts, and you see porcelains coming in, but through India. So India is still an important part of this picture. And there's plenty of evidence surviving now of the kind of Habsburg network, if Cinta doesn't mind me saying, that she outlined in her book, which is crucial for the inter-port exchange of lots of Chinese goods, including porcelain, like this one. And I was never sure if the story about using porcelain as ransom was true, but if it is, I mean, it's another very interesting form of acquisition that you see in Europe. And then, of course, the so-called Iberian Union was crucial to this, and the figure of Philip II, who Cinta has published a lot about. So, there is evidence, but also, as Cinta pointed out, it's not the same evidence of consumption and trade that you're going to find in other parts of the world at the same time. A lot of it, as far as I know, is broken, and it really wasn't highly valued in the court. But Philip II becomes an important conduit for the movement of Chinese porcelain around the kind of Habsburg world at the time, including to his cousin, Archduke Ferdinand, who had over almost 250 blue and white porcelain, many of which were displayed in the same way that they were displayed in the Alcazar. But Chinese paintings were also in Ferdinand's Kunstkammer, his kind of cabinet of curiosities. There were quite a few paintings, 4 of them survive today, and it's entirely possible that they were actually made by quite a famous Chinese painter. Those of you who know anything about it might know the name Qiu Ying. He was the most successful painter in the Ming period, and these are very much in his style. So these were not export paintings. These were very much for local consumption, yet there are still 4 of them. The difficulty is that for a long time, they were described as Indian, as in the Indies in the inventory. So you have to also think kind of sideways when you're trying to look through inventory in Europe, as Chinta found out, to really determine what they're referring to at that time. But we also know that the Saxon and Bavarian courts were consumers of Chinese goods, including porcelains, and you could even get a crock porcelain with your coat of arms on it. And it's through looking at some of these people that you find out how they acquired things, through buying agents who might also be affiliated with Philip II. And then courts were exchanging porcelains and Chinese goods, such as the Medicis, gifting porcelains to the Saxon court, like these. These are 2 of the pieces, very similar to the ones that were found in Puranicula, by the way. And then, of course, Philip II is also the great-grandfather of Charles II, and it's through the Habsburg line that you can see this movement quite clearly, including, and this is a piece that Chinta shows in her book, through the women Habsburg as well, who are quite an important part of this story. And a lot of these are associated with new drinking habits, like tea drinking in Britain and hot chocolate in the Iberian world, and then, of course, France through all of this. And porcelains are important diplomatic gifts in Europe at this time as well, such as these 2 very famous jars that were given by the Portuguese ambassador to the Queen of Sweden at the time, Queen Christina, who's a very interesting person if you're looking for a royal history that's not just about the men. I would strongly urge you to look into her. These are today on display in the Far Eastern Museum in Stockholm. And that part of the story also has quite a long history. The use of Chinese porcelain as continuous diplomatic gifts through European royal courts. The most famous example, and the earliest, being the so-called Fonthill Vase. And you can actually trace its movement through the European courts and then eventually to Britain through the art market, and Ireland, where it is today. And then finally, the last area, about which we don't know as much as everywhere else, is the Americas, both North and South. So I'm referring to the United States area, as well as South and Central America. But of course, the consumption here is associated with European colonization, so the Spanish and the British empires. And a big part of that is the establishment of the area known as New Spain. And what facilitated the movement here was this very significant so-called Manila galleon trade. And that meant that a huge range of goods from China were arriving at parts of the world which had not been originally participating in the trade slightly earlier. So silk, ivory, spices, and porcelain. And then these goods are interchanged between these colonial rulers within the Americas. So there is some evidence of certain ships which were shipping Chinese porcelain, but as far as I know, there's very little evidence beyond this. However, it does take us into an area which you can refer to as intercolonial trade, and that's an important mechanism for the movement of Chinese goods. And you can see that the taste was very much European, such as pieces like this. And there is some evidence, if you look at local consumption practices, the impact on local production, but this is a difficult area to study because a lot of the archaeology is still being done today. It's a kind of new area in which porcelain trade is becoming an important subject. And then North America, there's even less evidence here from the Ming period itself. So, for example, some of the earliest finds are possibly these shards that were found they're referred to as archaeological sites, but they are actually surface finds. So there's a lot of debate about the validity of them as evidence, but they were found off the coast and on the coast in Northern California, and they're known as the Drake's Bay shards. The earliest surviving archaeologically recovered Chinese porcelains in North America were found in the James River in Virginia, and for those of you who don't know anything about that, that was one of the original colonies, and it was the first settlement within Jamestown. So these would have been brought by the English when they first settled the Americas. Other evidence is really patchy. So 2 bowls were found at a very famous country house in New York, but not in a dated context. There are some slightly post-Ming references in a will, but the problem was American access to porcelain was restricted by English merchandise rules. So the English Navigation Act of 1651 required that all merchandise had to be supplied on British ships from British ports. So America comes into this story much later, after the War of Independence in 1776. But I have to say, I think an object like this really encompasses the complexity that is Chinese porcelain around the world, because this is a late Ming white porcelain lion dog, or as they're referred to in English, figure from Fujian, from the Dehua kiln, that was decorated by a very famous glass painter from Germany, Ignaz Preissler, using scenes from a book, an early book that had some of the first illustrations of America. So what you can see here on this panel is an early image of Florida, in the southern United States, which was and still is famous for alligators and crocodiles. They're not normally as big as dinosaurs, but I think this gives the impression of just how scary that seemed to the first European travelers. So the illustrator was French, and these French illustrations were the first European illustrations and images of the Americas, which was painted onto this piece of Chinese porcelain from the late Ming period. So I'll draw this to a close by saying, of course, after the Ming, the fall of the Ming itself would in fact stimulate competitive trade, because they were no longer competitive, and production globally. And until the later 18th century, Chinese goods of all types would continue to be desirable around the world. But of course, trade wars led to the events of what is considered China's worst century, the 19th century. So I'm just going to wonder what will be the legacy of today's trade wars with China. Thank you very much.